Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Got a very interesting gentleman to introduce you tonight, and a book that I think is really kind of fascinating that I read about just last week. And so I reached out to Mark Milke, PhD. He is the founder and president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy, and he's written a really fascinating book called The 1867 Project: Why Canada Should Be Cherished, Not Cancelled. Mark is a public policy analyst and author with 6 books and over 70 studies and over 1,000 columns published in the last 25 years. His policy work has been published by numerous different think tanks in Canada and internationally. He is the editor of the Aristotle Foundation's first book, as I mentioned, the 1867 Project. He's also currently president of the Sir Winston Churchill Society of Calgary and a past president of, is it Civitas? Civitas. His 6th book, The Victim Cult: How the Culture of Blame Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations, is an Amazon bestseller. Dr. Mark Milke, welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me on, Brian.
So tell me a little bit about this book, The 1867 Project. Why should we cherish Canada and not cancel it?
Right. Well, I think the best way to explain it is to think of an oak tree, right? Oak trees are one of my favorite trees. And why is that? They're big, they're beautiful. The canopy will shelter a lot of people underneath it. I've been been hit by hail a couple of times in my car in Calgary. And if I was sitting under an oak tree, the damage would be less or none at all. So oak trees protect what's below them. And Canada is a bit like that. A country or a civilization is a bit like that. It takes time to develop, but once it develops and you've got this great canopy, you can protect a lot of people underneath it. And that to me is Canada. So, but these days we have people that look at the tree and go, look, there's a diseased limb there. In 1867, we didn't, give the vote to Indigenous people or John A. Macdonald tribe, but it didn't happen. Or in 1910, we didn't have the vote for women yet. So the tree was imperfect. And yes, it was. But the solution to imperfection, when you look at a tree, is not to cut down the entire tree. It's to prune the limb, right? The diseased limb. Or in terms of a country, you change your policy. And these days, though, we have people that look at Canada and go, oh, well, there was an imperfection in its history. That must mean Canada was all bad, or John A. Macdonald was all bad, or so on and so forth. I think that's a great mistake. And it's also, I think, somewhat dangerous because, like an oak tree, you need your roots. And so you don't cut the roots. Otherwise, you topple the tree and nobody has any shade or shelter. So in essence, that's the genesis of the 1867 Project book. Myself and 19 other authors, we kind of gathered around and decided that somebody needed to write something about, first of all, some of the problems today in Canada and some of the attacks in Canada today, and then also to explain why we shouldn't negatively view everything in Canada as bad, look into some of the history and offer some nuance. And then the last part of the book, the 1867 Project, we look to the future and say, okay, what kind of Canada do we want? So that's kind of how it's organized, right? Problems today. Let's think about history with a little bit more nuance than we're hearing in the headlines today or seeing in the headlines. And let's look to the future. And what kind of future do we want?
Do you really think people are trying to cancel Canada?
Yeah. The chattering classes, anyway. I don't think it's a majority of Canadians. I do think, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I'm in Calgary, when the bureaucrats in Calgary City Hall tried to cancel the fireworks for Canada Day, it was because they thought Canada shouldn't be celebrated, and there was great pushback. Or when people ripped down the statue of John A. Macdonald in Montreal, removed one of him in Victoria. I think Queen Elizabeth's statue was attacked last week. Was it in Saskatoon or Regina? In Winnipeg, when the statue of Queen Victoria was attacked, and so on and so forth, right? Or when streets are renamed. Same thing happened in Halifax with Edward Cornwallis, the founder of Halifax. His statue was taken down. So yes, I think unfortunately there is this cancel culture. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's true nonetheless for that.
So let's talk about some of the people in Toronto, in Mississauga. One of the issues is Dundas Street. And I guess Dundas was a slave owner and someone that people thought not too nicely of. But yet one of the longest streets in all of Ontario is Dundas. So what should be the right strategy on that?
Well, Dundas, let me give you an example of another person, Ryerson, because Lynn MacDonald from Toronto, former New Democrat member of Parliament, wrote a chapter on Ryerson, Egerton Ryerson. And I assume it may be somewhat similar to the Dundas situation, where you've got someone in history that either isn't put in context, or yes, of course, maybe in their day, they did things or said things we wouldn't approve of today. But I'll get to that in a moment. Let's go to the chapter by Lynn MacDonald in the 1867 Project. So what Lynn does is say, look, if you understand the context of the time, first of all, the accusation against Ryerson, for example, is that somehow he's anti-Indigenous or was involved in residential schools, even though he died before they mostly came into being. Most of them did. And she points out that, look, Egerton Ryerson was the founder of free public education in Canada. And he was deep friends with the Ojibwe First Nation in Ontario, and in fact, learned the language. So you have to put people in their historical context and also understand the challenges of their era. So look, before this is, and the slavery question is an interesting one, because most people in human history thought slavery was normal. So we named the Aristotle Foundation after Aristotle, and he was a slave owner or approved of slavery. And we didn't do it because he approved of slavery. We did it for other reasons. He wrote about friendship, politics, the good life, which is the question we want to ask at the Aristotle Foundation. What's the good life? But if you cancel a person in history because they held some of the views or practices of their day, then what we're in essence saying is, Brian, you and I have arrived at the pinnacle of truth in 2023, and anything before is disreputable. That actually misses the point of actually how did we change from back then? Or were there some good ideas back then that led to the development of how we think today? And in fact, the British Empire, which is routinely pilloried these days in Canada, was a good example of that. It was in the British Empire that slavery was fought after the British did a 180 on slavery, along with us in Canada and others around the world. It was the British Empire that fought slavery in the 19th century. And yet today, there's a one-sided view of, say, the colonial era. So no empire is perfect, no person is perfect. I can't speak to Dundas in particular, but again, in terms of Egerton Ryerson, the notion that he should have been canceled or his statue taken down or the university renamed is nonsensical if you understand what he contributed to Canada. And if we expect perfection, it's actually quite utopian. So I can go to that next, Brian, but I mean, that's part of the problem is we're viewing history in a very narrow, I think, unfortunate way where we expect people in history to be perfect. And that's actually one of the problems today is people aren't thinking about history, I think, in a sensible way. People
are looking for perfection. And there's that old line about perfection is the enemy of the good. So, Ryerson, Metropolitan University, did they make a mistake? And did they not do the right research? Or did they just give in to public cancel culture?
I think Lynn MacDonald in her chapter in the book, in the 1867 Project, would argue all of the above, right? And here's the thing. I mean, back to, again, the perfectionist way that people view history these days. Think about how silly that is, for one. But let me put it in a bigger context. Utopianism has always been a problem in human history. But what was the utopian movement, or one of the main utopian movements in the last century? It was Marxists, right? They looked to they wanted to create a perfect society, perfect equality. Now, they were dead wrong on economics, on human nature, on everything, in my view. And I think the record shows that. But at least Marxists could argue they were looking to the future to create their perfect society. But today we have people that are utopian about the past. They look back to the past and think somehow Johnny MacDonald should have been perfect, or should have known the full kind of flowering of liberty-seeking notions that British classical liberals like himself held. Why didn't he give the vote to women right away when he entered Parliament or something, right? So I don't think people understand the development of ideas. So again, there's this utopianism that somehow they look back and expect a perfect age, which is full of hubris, because you're not perfect, I'm not perfect. 100 years from now, people will look back and say, Brian and Mark, how could you believe X on some issue?
You mean we're not perfect now?
Exactly. So they will look back and wonder how we could have believed what we did on something. And, because we're not omniscient. So, and I think it also misunderstands how, history, at least in the Anglosphere, and some of the good things we've got now, developed. They literally developed from this notion that, you can trace it back 1,000 or 2,000 years if you want. But this notion, especially in the last 500 years, that the individual is worth something in law and policy, and they should be treated as an individual, not part of a collective. And especially in the last several hundred years, the result of really sort of, I would say, monotheism and Judaism and Christianity, but the Enlightenment and other developments that led to this notion that the individual is worth something. And in fact, it's that notion of the individual as moral equals that led to the push for the abolishment of slavery, because white Brits and white Canadians, and eventually white Americans said this is ridiculous. Black Americans, Black Canadians, Black Europeans, Black British are human beings like the rest of us. We should not engage in slavery, and that was, of course, the right thing to do. But that took millennia to get there.
A while.
It came from a certain conception. So to not understand that and to wipe away history and start from year zero, as the utopians seem to want to do, it's like, I have this image of an oak tree where they're yanking up the roots, and I'm like, do you have any understanding of what you're doing here? You're actually destroying the very foundations of what allowed us to be a free, flourishing society.
I went to see the musical Hamilton. I'm not sure if you had an opportunity to see it, but number one, just in a great piece of theater. There's just no question about it. And to have hip hop done and rap music telling a story for the whole length of the show is really quite amazing. But I guess to your point, the interesting thing is how incredibly beneficial to American thought Alexander Hamilton was, but how failed he was as a person in so many ways at the same time. And so people aren't perfect, and he had these imperfections that were part of him and part of what made the story so incredibly interesting, but that would be incredibly canceled today. And yet his intellect and his writings, where some people think he wrote the vast majority of the Federalist Papers, etc., were so critical to what happened in the United States. And I think that's another example that people aren't perfect. Anyway,
well, it's a terrific example. Again, why would we expect people to be different than the age they were in, even though some of them were far seen even for their age? It's a bit of a dicey way to view history. I mean, again, what led to, say, the freedom down south eventually, right, in the United States? Well, it did have to do with Hamilton. It did have to do with Madison. It did have to do with George Washington. George Washington had slaves, and yet this was the country that understood the problem of power, right? When they turfed out King George and created the Loyalists that ended up founding Canada eventually, they understood the problem of concentrated power. So they designed a system with the House, the Senate, the White House, judiciary eventually, and they did that for specific reasons. They were fearful of concentrated power, which they just experienced in their view. Loyalists might take a slightly different view, obviously, but nonetheless, they grasped the problem of concentrated power. And to not understand that is what eventually allowed for, say, the North in the United States to fight the South, and this notion that the individual had value. Yes, they didn't practice it perfectly in 1776 and us in 1867. But the question is, what are the ideas eventually that allowed them and us to progress, as we would put it, to abolish slavery, to give the vote to women, to give the vote to Indigenous Canadians, to open up Canada to more people from around the world, as we started to do in the 1970s and to a lesser degree before? Well, it was the notion that individuals should be treated equally. And so the 1867 project is trying to both sort of say, listen, understand the history that actually occurred, because it's more nuanced than people think, and also that there's seeds of our own flourishing free country today in past centuries. And let's not, kill those seeds, so to speak, or pretend they don't exist, because then people just think, what, magically we arrived at 2023 with everyone over 18 who had the right to vote? To not understand the development of history actually is I think, either, again, silly or dangerous, or both.
We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Mark Milke in just 2 minutes, talking about the 1867 project with Canada, why Canada should be cherished and not canceled. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Mark Milke Dr. Mark Milke is my guest tonight. He is the president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy, and he, along with several other authors, have written a book called The 1867 Project, obviously the year that Canada was born. Why Canada should be cherished and not canceled. And we're chatting about the book, and we're chatting about the Aristotle Foundation, which is the charity that the not-for-profit, the public policy organization that is he's president of and spurring this development. And I got to tell you, if I could just for a second, this is a pretty smart man that we're talking to tonight. He's got a bachelor's degree in political science and history from the University of Alberta, master's degree in political science from the University of Alberta, a doctorate in international relations and political philosophy from the University of Calgary. And oh my gosh, this guy's had some interesting jobs. So he worked for the Canadian Taxpayers Foundation. He worked for the Frontier Center for Public Policy. He worked for the Fraser Institute. He worked for a grant management consultant. He was a public policy advisor to Jason Kenney, the United Conservative Party of Alberta. He was a co-founder and senior fellow of Second Street Org and executive director of the Canadian Energy Center, various not-for-profits companies. He served as a public policy analyst, author, columnist, and a keynote speaker. And now, as I mentioned, he's president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. And more important than all those, he was an English teacher. That must have been fun. In Japan?
It was, yeah. I spent 2 years in Japan between my bachelor's and my master's. I was in the cold northern city of Edmonton, and I grew up in southern British Columbia, so Edmontonians will have to excuse me. And after my bachelor's, I thought I want to go someplace warm. Didn't know what I wanted to do, but thought it'd be nice to do something overseas. Didn't know how, but kind of stumbled into this process where you could apply for a job teaching English in Japan, and in the schools there. Never thought I'd be hired. They hired me. I had to cut my long hair. I had long hair at the time, and after tree planting for a summer. And I went to Japan for 2 years and quite enjoyed it. When you travel, but especially when you live somewhere as well, you begin to discover things about other cultures, other people that you think, wow, I quite like that. And it makes you think about your own culture and country in a different way. And there's things you miss about home, and there's things that you think, yeah, there's things I'd like to take back. So I discovered I had a love for, maybe, more simple architecture and art that I didn't know existed. I mean, I love Frank Lloyd Wright, and the Japanese have kind of that more simple style, which I like, as opposed to very complicated, maybe French or Chinese style of art. And so just a personal preference, and discovered that about myself. But the Japanese were terrific hosts as well. So it was a great experience in the 1990s to be in Japan for 2 years.
Fantastic. Tell me about this book, the 1867 Project, that you say has numerous different authors. What were some of the most controversial chapters?
Sure. I think Matthew Lau. So Matthew Lau is a Toronto financial analyst and a public policy wonk in his own right. So Matthew wrote a chapter on the question, is Canada institutionally racist? And spoiler alert, what Matthew does is he looks into income statistics and by ethnicity and race in Canada. And he does a great analysis, sort of like Thomas Sowell, the American economist, for those who are familiar with him. But in the Canadian context, Matthew Lau does this analysis and says, look, first of all, let's define institutional or systemic racism. Don't confuse that with personal prejudice, right? You can meet a bigot on the street, but that doesn't mean Canada as a country is institutionally racist. It once was, but Matthew argues in his chapter in the 1867 Project that it is not now. So what Matthew does is he goes through the income statistics and the rest of it and points out that, look, if your background, if your heritage is East Asian, for example, you're Taiwanese or Chinese background, as Matthew is, Korean or Japanese, male or female, you're actually at the top of the income heap. And those of us have more pale skin are in the middle. So, and there are people that are below white Canadians in terms of income, but there are reasons for that. Different education levels, for example. So if you're Indigenous Canadian, the average education level is lower than, say, someone whose heritage hails from Taiwan, for example. And that population is also younger, the Indigenous population on average, than, say, those of Japanese ethnicity or historical origin. So, and that matters because when you get older, you make more money than when you're 17 or 19. So the averages make a difference. So Matthew does a great job of getting into those sorts of numbers. And basically he concludes, look, there's reverse racism these days, which he thinks that's systemic racism, institutional racism. But he argues, as again, someone who's Chinese Canadian, to think that we live in the 1940s or 1870s when there was real institutional racism is a mistaken notion. And to be clear about what, again, systemic racism is, go back 100 years to the city of San Francisco, when whites there refused to allow those of Chinese ethnicity into their hospitals. The Chinese of San Francisco had to build their own hospitals because of that sort of systemic institutional racism. So the problem is these days, people throw around the word racism and racist and institutional racism in a very sloppy manner, and throw it out there as if we are Alabama in 1923 and not Canada in 2023. Actually, let me give you an example from Ontario too, where systemic racism was uprooted in the 1950s. It was in 1951 and 1952 that the Ontario government began to pass laws against discrimination based on color or gender or ethnicity in accommodation and in hiring. So Ontario actually dealt with the problem, legally anyway, of systemic racism 70 years ago. And yet we have people today that claim Canada is still a systemically racist country. So frankly, we're not. So
just about 3 years ago right now, we had the George Floyd incident, murder in Minneapolis, I think it was. And I had numerous different people on my show during that time period, from Mississauga, from Brampton, from Toronto, etc., that were African Canadians, Black Canadians, who told me story after story after story of anti-Black racism that they encountered. Where no one had not been pulled over, carded, had their identities checked on numerous occasions, questioned if they were driving a fancy car, not getting jobs, being looked down upon, being, dealt with in a very racist manner. And the statistics in regards to prison populations are astounding, and you probably know them far better than I. But Black people in our prison system are something like 4 times, 5 times what the proportion of white people for the population are, and our Indigenous communities are a multiple of that. Represented in our prison populations, and so people would say that we've got institutional racism, we've got a criminal justice system that doesn't work and is racist, and a penal system that is even more racist. And then, right around that same time, we had a supervisor put in place for the Board of Education in Brampton because the Ontario government deemed that the Board of Education was institutionally racist against Blacks.
Sure, that's the accusation, but that's not the fact that a greater proportion of some cohort, some population is represented in a statistic doesn't mean that you've got an institutionally racist society. So let me be clear about what I mean by that. And again, Matthew Lau details this to some degree in the book, in the 1867 Project. And I've gone through some of these statistics in my previous book, The Victim Cult, more in that book than in this one. I go into great detail in The Victim Cult about that. The problem with saying, this particular cohort is, far greater, represented in the prison system, for example, Indigenous Canadians, is it misses a few things. The first thing it misses is, and it's the same with Black Americans, most people who are Indigenous are in jail, not because they, attacked another ethnicity or race, because Indigenous on Indigenous crime is what's been happening. And so when someone says, well, maybe that person shouldn't be in jail, look, if you're if you're Indigenous male and you've attacked your girlfriend, chances are she's Indigenous, and chances are that's why you're in jail. And so we can't simply say that there's institutional racism. Now, let me back up to a worldwide view. Thomas Sowell, the American economist, who, if your listeners don't know who he is, happened to have grown up in the South and in Harlem, happens to be Black, which is not incidental to anything except that he can't really be accused of somehow apologizing for, white nationalism or something silly. Thomas Sowell, who's now 92, has spent about 50 years on this very issue, race and culture and incomes, and trying to explain to people that correlation does not equal causation always. That even when you find racism out there, it doesn't necessarily mean racism is the cause of something. So he gives a great example that I like to repeat. If you look around the world historically, Italians have dominated the fishing fleets worldwide, unlike, say, the Swiss. Why is that? Is it because the Swiss are discriminated against in the fishing industry worldwide? No, very simply, for a geographic reason that has nothing to do with race or nationality. The Swiss have no coastlines, right? The Italians have coastlines. And so that's why the Italians dominate, because, of course, they were involved in that industry. And it's important to get to apple. So that's an example of where, you can't take one factor like race and say, well, it must have been racism, why the Swiss weren't involved. No, there's other factors, geography. It's the same with some of these other conversations people have and accusations that people make. One of the things I did in the victim cult is I looked at apple to apple comparisons. One of the reasons Indigenous Canadians on average have lower incomes, say, than other Canadians is because, again, they're younger on average than other Canadians, the average population, and also the education levels are lower. So what you have to do is you have to adjust for that, and you have to do apple to apple comparisons. And what I found was if you take out, a very specific Statistics Canada cohort, because it's the only way to do the apple to apple comparison. If you're between the ages of 25 and 34, so you're a young adult, you have a university degree, you work full-time, full year, it doesn't matter if you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. You make almost the same income. And in fact, if you have a bachelor's degree or higher, as an Indigenous young adult in that age cohort I just mentioned, you make slightly more than the rest of, than other Canadians would in that age category. So that's an apple to apple comparison. And what's positive about it is that it shows the potential for incomes to rise among Indigenous Canadians. But the keys are usually education and geography. Right? If you're in the middle of nowhere on a reserve in northern Manitoba, it's tough to get a good income and to get a good education, right? So the key thing is to be near a major city and to have an education, and that's what makes incomes go higher. So that's how I'd push back on the notion that correlation equals causation, or that race is the only factor or the major factor in some of these disparities you see in outcomes.
So there's been some press this past weekend of a major agreement in Ontario between the province of Ontario and Indigenous people to make effectively reparations for past injustice, and then a proposal in California for billions and billions of dollars to be spent on reparations to Black Americans in California. What do you think of those? Are those right, or are they comparable to your?
Several things. So in the 1867 project, Matthew Lau, people should read his chapter on race and income, and they'll get a better sense of cause and effect, and also the history of Canada. In terms of reparations, I wrote about those in detail in the Victim Cult, which you can also buy on Amazon, and the Canadian edition came out 3 years ago. But in the Victim Cult, I note these arguments about compensation. So a couple of things I'd say. First of all, when it comes to Indigenous Canada, actually Canada has spent a lot of the last 100 years trying to make up or trying to fund improvements in outcomes for Indigenous Canadians. One of the studies I did about 10 years ago for the Fraser Institute showed a massive uptick in spending per capita, adjusted for inflation, after 1945. And a lot of spending on First Nations peoples, on other Indigenous Canadians over the last 80 years that actually didn't have to be done according to treaty or constitution. But governments did so because they were trying to help improve outcomes among First Nations people in Canada. So that's the first thing I'd say. There's a lot of money that's been spent that sometimes hasn't been spent wisely or correctly, but nonetheless, the effort has been there. So when you talk about compensation, people should also look at existing spending, which has been tremendous, actually, a lot. And there's also benefits for some First Nations people, say on reserves, like tax exemptions, which are not due to treaty or constitution in most cases, but a result of the Indian Act. So it's not required, but it's there, and it's a benefit if you're a First Nations person on reserve. You get a certain break that other Canadians don't. I think all of that has to enter into the conversation about compensation. And then lastly, the other thing I'd say is, and this is what I wrote about in the Victim Cult, it's never that you should never compensate, but I think it matters if you're closer to the egregious event that occurred. So let me give you a couple of clear examples. In the late 18th century, when Quakers freed their slaves, this was in the United States, they paid compensation to their slaves because they recognized what a great evil they had done to the Black Americans they just freed. So that was the people that did the wrong, compensating people who had been wronged, greatly, obviously. Same thing with Japanese Canadians. There was some payments after World War II for their property that was stolen by governments that interned them wrongly, horribly in this country, as well as the United States. It was very little, though, and it should have been more. And in the 1980s, some more payments were made to Japanese Canadians. And again, I don't think it was enough. The government stole their property. It was egregious what they did for 4 years in World War II. So though there are cases where we should compensate, but it's an art more, or it's an art more than an exact science. And I would say the further you get back from the event, and also if you don't take into account the other side of the ledger, how much, for example, the Civil War cost the United States, the North, that fought to abolish slavery. One of the things I pointed out in the victim cult is the money spent on trying to win the war against the South by the North, the United States, was about the same as what the estimates are for the cost of slavery to American slaves. Same thing with the British, who fought to abolish slavery around the world for the 19th century. What they spent on that matched or exceeded what the calculations are for how much they garnered from slavery before they did a 180 on it. So I think all of these things have to factor in the conversation. But I would say the farther you get away from the incident, I think the more tenuous the claim becomes for compensation.
We're chatting tonight with Mark Milke. He's the president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy, and his organization has recently published a fascinating book, The 1867 Project. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Mark Milke. He is the president of the Aristotle Foundation, and he's, along with his organization, written a book called The 1867 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished and Not Canceled. And I found your vision on your website really quite interesting. The vision is a Canada where the sacrifices and successes of past generations are cherished and built upon, where citizens value each other for their character and merit, and where open inquiry and free expression are prized as the best path to a flourishing future for all. We champion reason, democracy, and civilization so that future generations can participate in a free, flourishing Canada. But I guess you think that we're not doing that too many people want to cancel that and they want to take a look at it.
I think we're in a bit of a negative spiral right now. And again, I don't think it's the majority of Canadians, but I think the chattering classes, right? A lot of the politicians, certainly those in academia and media, and some of the what's called the diversity, equity, and inclusion folks in corporations, for example, who see a racist Canada, again, an institutionally racist Canada, as opposed to the occasional bigot out there, and I think are wrong in that for reasons I've explained. I think that's the unfortunate thing. I think we want to be careful not to make the mistake that is common in human history. And that is, in most of human history, people have been tribal. They haven't looked at each other as individuals. They've looked at each other as Catholic or Muslim or white or Black. And we were just getting away from that. And then for various reasons, again, I think this misunderstood, these theories that talk about institutional racism, Abraham Kendi and others, who I think are actually very simplistic and monocausal. I think we're back into the soup now, where people are starting to look at each other based not on character or merit, but on these other characteristics, and that's dangerous. So I do think we need to get back to a vision of shared humanity, and it's important to put the individual at the center of law and policy. You know who actually argued for this, and people forget this in Canada, but it's a very positive vision. United around laudable ideas, right? The worth of the individual, or other good ideas. Open markets, I would argue. The rule of law. Remind me to tell you about my experience in Hong Kong and those conversations. But while I think of it, one of the things at the end of the 1867 project, in the chapter that I wrote, and I'm just one of 19 authors, but I bring out Pierre Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau was a collectivist in many ways, especially economically, and wrong, I think. But where he was right was on how much worth he placed on the value of the individual. And in a speech in 1992, when he opposed the Charlottetown Accord, which would have given Quebec rights in the Constitution to discriminate collectively, right? Would have cemented those rights in the Constitution to be seen as a distinct society and discriminate collectively based on language and other characteristics. Trudeau ripped into that, and he said, first of all, you are all equal, and he meant moral equals as individuals. And he said, also, your rights come not from the state; they originate with you. And in essence, what he was saying in 1992, and I quote him in the book, is that it's a mistake that we hand our rights over to the states, so to speak, right? So they can do some things, publicly, right? They can tax us all. But the bargain we make is that you as the state have to treat me as an individual. You can't tax me less or more because of my skin color, that sort of thing. You can't not give me a program because I'm a certain skin color or gender from a certain country. That's the way it's supposed to be. That was the liberal vision, actually, the classical liberal vision. And in that sense, Pierre Trudeau was epitomized that. These days, though, you've got his son and others who think it's great to discriminate based on one's color because somehow you benefited or, because of your history, just because of how you look. It's nonsensical for reasons I've explained before. This differences in outcomes between groups is blamed entirely on racism. Pierre Trudeau thought it really dangerous to give groups rights or discriminate against one group versus another, Anglophones versus Francophones, or based on skin color, because he understood that when you give the collective power to discriminate against people, to give the government power to discriminate based on things that have nothing to do, that you can't change, or not likely to change, the fact you speak English or French, that you end up pitting groups against groups and you end up destroying kind of the fabric of civil society. So he believed in equal opportunity for the individual and equality before the law for the individual. And I think that's the vision actually we need to get back to in Canada, this notion of shared humanity. And we've gone down the wrong rabbit trail here in the last couple of years on some of these issues.
So we should not have Quebec as a distinct society, and we should not support affirmative action. Is that correct?
Race and gender quotas, as I call them. No, because let me put it this way. There was a fellow, dean, at a school here, one of the faculties at the University of Calgary, who I talked to back in the middle of winter about a very specific hire they were going to do based on race. And I gave him some of the arguments I've given tonight in the show, Brian. And I said to him at the end, and he gave me the usual excuses for why, race and gender quotas were okay, and historic discrimination or discrimination now, he argued, systemic. And, and he hadn't sort of read deeply on the matter, to be blunt about it. But I said at the end of it, I summed it up this way. I said, so you're telling me, based on your category here, of you're only going to hire according to X skin color, that you wouldn't hire the great-granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor because you think she's privileged? Are you kidding me? He had no answer, right? And that's the problem. You have to look at people as individuals. In fact, I would abolish what some call affirmative action, but what I call race and gender quotas, and replace them with what it should be, which is that you want to help people based on their income. If you're poor, of course, we want to help you get into university. That's how I got in. Right, I had to take out a student loan. My parents didn't have any money. They lost everything in the 1980s. I don't come from privilege. So I appreciated the fact that other taxpayers are willing to loan me a bit so I could get into university when I was 20 years old. So that's what you do, is you treat people as individuals. You don't discriminate based on unchangeable characteristics. That just breeds resentment. Also, plus you could subsidize the wrong people. Again, back to the compensation argument. If someone moves here, I've got a friend who's skin color is not mine. Her heritage is, the West Indies, and her skin color is black. She despises the notion that someone who maybe immigrated here long after slavery might get compensated for a wrong that wasn't done to them. And again, this is the problem with compensation for historical wrongs, as opposed to compensating for something that happened yesterday or 5 years ago. So, no, I think some of this is quite disastrous. You want to treat people as individuals. It's the Martin Luther King vision. But, old ills and old evil show up in new wineskins, so to speak. And that's the danger. You have to be on, people have always been tribal.
Justin Trudeau's brag about his cabinet 50-50 male-female. You would disagree with that?
Well, look, I think natural diversity is a good thing. Look, in the 1867 project, we've got every kind of color under the rainbow, so to speak. We've got, people who are Democrats and conservatives and liberals, atheists and agnostics and faith types. That's a natural diversity, but it came about because we were just interested in a certain, project, the 1867 project as a book. So natural diversity is fine, but I think forced quotas, again, all of a sudden you get into the weeds. Instead of treating as people as individuals, should we now overcorrect or say, a greater proportion of females in nursing or teaching or some other thing? That's what happens when the state gets involved in micromanaging everyone to an exact 50-50 proportion. Again, why would you do that? Should fishing fleets around the world adjust for the lack of Swiss or, somebody from the Czech Republic in the fishing industry? Or do you simply, again, try and provide opportunity wherever possible and treat people equally in law and policy?
That's you have another chapter that
Pierre Trudeau vision.
You have another chapter that claims that John A. Macdonald saved more Indigenous lives than any other prime minister.
This was the reference, earlier to our Macdonald discussion. So Greg Piasecki, a Toronto lawyer and a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario, and with other Indigenous history in his family tree as well, wrote this chapter. And Greg's argument is fourfold. Number one, when you look, for example, at the creation of the Northwest Mounted Police in Western Canada, that was done specifically to prevent what happened south of the border, what was called the Indian Wars, where Americans were just settling the West without treaties. So first of all, John A. Macdonald emboldened the treaty process in the West. They wanted treaties, and this was part of the priority of the British Crown before Canada was even a nation. You want treaties before you can settle. And that was a priority of the British Crown. And John A. Macdonald continued that. So Greg makes the case that that was the first point. The second is that he created the Northwest Mounted Police, today's RCMP, precisely to keep peace on the prairies, and he did. And to protect the first settlers, people now we call Indigenous, from later settlers. And Macdonald was explicit about that in Parliament. He also talks about famine relief under John A. Macdonald. When the buffalo herds began disappearing from the Canadian and American West, and Indigenous Canadians began to starve, there was an agreement with those with treaties that food was to be provided to those on reserve. And Macdonald is criticized for not providing enough off reserve, and that's another kind of episode almost that you can have Greg come back and discuss. But in fact, Parliament was very generous, and Macdonald was very generous vis-a-vis the famine relief program that the opposition Liberals didn't want him to be so generous on. And Macdonald defended, providing food, of course, to people who were starving or near starving.
So, given all this, why is the criticism of him?
Well, again, I think we're back to this. Well, because if they say one thing in 1867 that today we think is, so for example, famine relief is a good thing. Macdonald talks about he only provides half rations. And that's taken out of context. He talks to people off reserve who actually the government had no legal obligation to. But of course, he had a moral obligation to. And Macdonald and the government were trying to force people, Indigenous folk, back to the reserves where there was an agreement that you would receive full rations. And, they were trying to settle the West and put, Indians, as they called them at the time, on reserve. So part of that was wrong-headed, but the right part of it was making sure people had food. But so because of comments like that, or residential schools, which Macdonald is blamed for, but they were voluntary, and in fact they were required by treaty, as Greg Piasecki in this chapter in the book also talks about. The Macdonald responded to in treaties by First Nations leaders who wanted residential schools in their day, and that was part of the treaty process. You had to do that as the federal government if a First Nations leader requested it, so they did. So again, what Greg tries to do is provide context. But these days, nobody wants context. They simply want to say, well, residential schools were all bad, and therefore John A. Macdonald was a horrible person for being part of that program. Well, that's simplistic, and it overlooks a number of things. But
I guess the other analogy is not every Catholic church was bad, but there were some priests that weren't all that nice.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think residential schools is one of those things these days where you can barely discuss because people seem to have their minds made up, or there's absolutely no nuance. And these days it's made akin to genocide, which I think is a terrible accusation, actually, of the founders. So that's I think why. And also back to our earlier, people in 2023 think, well, why in 1867 didn't they think or say X like we would today? Well, because it was 1867 in part, but also you have to deal with the fact that in 1867 or 1920, Canada was, they were fighting battles of their own those days on other matters. I mean, it's amazing anybody could reform Canada in what we would consider a positive direction today. When you think about how rural Canada was, when you think, there weren't trains to most cities, reserves today that are remote. Think about how to reach them in the 1800s. The fact that they were able to actually bring smallpox vaccinations to reserves across the country, which was another success that Greg points to in the 1867 project chapter that he wrote. The fact that they were able to inoculate most Indigenous Canadians from smallpox at one point.
This sounds like just a fascinating book. How do I get it?
Amazon.ca, right? Or just go to the 1867project.ca. You'll go to our website at the Aristotle Foundation. But if you go to Amazon, you can pick up the 1867 project there.
Mark Milke, thank you so much for sharing this with us. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having a really interesting time tonight talking with Mark Milke. He's the president of the Aristotle Foundation. He's written a book about the 1867 project, about how we should cherish Canada and not cancel it. It's been a really interesting conversation, Mark. You know, why did you do this? Yeah, you think about your argument about cancel culture and stuff. The easier thing to do would be to just go with the flow and not make this argument. You're going to be seen as being provocateur and stuff. Why did you decide to do this, sir?
Well, I think it probably is, family history. I mean, I grew up in the 1980s when my parents lost everything. My grandparents on my dad's side came here in the 1920s as immigrants, had nothing. Everybody's family built Canada, starting with Indigenous, people whose ancestors came here 20,000 years ago, to French fur traders, to my family. And so I think it's a mistake to focus only on the faults of the past as opposed to hold it. These people were, in many cases, trying their best, and they weren't ogres. Not my grandparents, not other people's ancestors. We're not talking Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin. So I think correcting the historical record, but also reminding people how much progress has been made and to focus on what we need to focus on, which is, given, for example, the immigration that we have now in Canada and have had for decades, this is a very identity diverse country. We don't want to divide people based on identities. No one can change your identities. No one should change your identities. You want to unite people around laudable ideas, the worth of the individual, I would say an open economy, the rights of women, and so I think that's what we need to do in Canada. So that's what's driving me, is I think we're headed down a destructive path, and I think we need to unite around laudable ideas that have the potential to unite Canadians no matter their ancestry, color of their skin, and that sort of thing.
Mark Milke, thank you so much for joining us and telling us a little bit about your book. Again, where can we buy it?
The 1867 Project is available at Amazon.ca. So thank you, Brian.
That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Calgary, sir, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videocasts are available on my website. And, Canada Day is coming up. And I think that Mark has really raised some issues that we should be thinking about as we celebrate Canada's birthday. Interesting. Good night, everybody.